Equal Employment Opportunity by Felicia Freeman, Human Resources Management, Milligan College. So we're going to review the history of equal employment opportunity legislation. We'll review 7 regulations, specifically the Equal Pay Act of 1963, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and the ADA Amendments Act of 2008, Sections 102 and 103 of the Civil Rights Act of 1991, and Title I of Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008. Then we'll review the human resources challenges that Christians face in regards to equal employment opportunities, and then the reference page as well. So to get us started, the history, the equal employment opportunity legislation. First of all, we'll define equal employment opportunity. Our text says is a term used to describe the laws, regulations, and processes related to fair treatment of employees. And then our text also describes discrimination as treating people differently in employment situations because of characteristics such as race, color, and gender. Those things have nothing to do with their ability to perform a particular job. The 2 regulatory agencies are the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they are responsible for developing the guidelines and overseeing compliance for the anti-discrimination laws. And then also there's the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, and they develop the guidelines and oversee compliance for the executive orders. So basically, the Equal Employment Opportunity legislation came about after the very tumultuous 60s and the civil rights movement. Of course, everyone knows during that time period there was major segregation, obviously, between whites and African Americans or other races. So racism was a prominent issue during that time frame. Societal conflict was at an all-time high, and discrimination as well, with people being unfairly treated in the workplace, and that in addition to race, of course, women were not on the same level as men as far as their treatment as well. But primarily we're talking about the civil rights movement in the 60s. It was in June of 1963 that President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation, and he moved for civil rights legislation. And I'll spare you reading this entire quote, but I'd love for you to take a minute to read through here. This was basically the televised conversation or speech, if you will, by President Kennedy. And obviously it was a very important time, and he was motivated to make these changes, and it was President Lyndon B. Johnson who moved forward and made this one of his first acts as president after the assassination of President Kennedy. You can find more information on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission website, which I have listed at the bottom of this slide. It was full of information on how they got started and what events came about. Additionally, what you'll see here is kind of a flow process from our textbook as well, and it talks about how, or I'm sorry, I guess it just points out or highlights how laws are put into place, and it's similar to the same way that our standard laws here in the United States are created. Obviously, there's the development of laws and the equal employment opportunity guidelines. Of course, Congress goes and lobbies for these changes that address societal or economic problems. Laws are then passed to address the problems, and there's enforcement agencies that are created to see that companies comply with these laws. The agencies develop and communicate the guidelines, regulations. The employers are forced to comply, and then if they don't, the courts will hear about those violations. So specifically, the protected classes, race, sex, religion, color, national origin, age, 40 and over, disability, veteran status, pregnancy, and genetic information. Those are the different segments or groups that are specifically protected from discrimination in the workplace. So first we'll talk about the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Basically, it prohibits the discrimination in pay on the basis of gender for any individuals performing jobs with the same skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions unless there is another factor other than gender that is used to determine the pay difference. And basically, this act protects all it's for all employers with one or more employees, including the federal government. So basically, this just ensures that everyone is getting paid fairly. Now, of course, even though this was enacted in 1963, here we are in 2018, and our text, I think, even highlights this point that women, there's still a large wage gap, and women make approximately 79 cents on the dollar compared to men. So although there have been major improvements, we still have room to make positive change. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits the discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, which also includes, I failed to mention in the earlier slide, this includes gender identity and sexual orientation as well. Then also national origin. It was established, it also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as the enforcement agency to oversee, as we talked about, the anti-discrimination laws. So their protection here is provided to employers with 15 or more employees, which includes all private employers, federal, state, and local governments, educational institutions, private and public employment agencies, any labor organizations, joint labor management committees, controlling apprenticeship and training programs as well. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 prohibits employees from discriminating against individuals aged 40 or older. This applies to all employers who have 20 or more employees, again, including employment agencies, labor organizations, federal, state, local governments, and school districts. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978 specifies that women who are pregnant or who are affected by pregnancy-related conditions are to be treated the same as other applicants or employees with similar limitations or disabilities. And this applies to employers with 15 or more employees, of course, again, including all private employers, federal, state, local governments. So basically with the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, employers are just required to treat pregnant employees the same as non-pregnant employees, basically who would be temporarily disabled for any other reason. The Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and then the follow-up ADA Amendments Act of 2008. This prohibits discrimination in employment practices against any qualified individual with a disability who could still perform the job with or without reasonable accommodation. This applies, again, to employers with 15 or more employees, and this includes all private, federal, state, and local governments. So in this particular case, the Act is to ensure that everyone, regardless of disability, is entitled to fair and equal treatment. So just because let's say a person is in a wheelchair does not mean that they're not able to work a desk job or answer phones or things of that nature. And basically, as long as the business could provide some type of accommodation, a wheelchair ramp, to ensure that the employee could make it to work or make it into the building, then they should be treated just as everyone else. So basically, this title is intended to help those with disabilities have access to the same employment opportunities or benefits to those that do not have disabilities. And in 2008, the amendment was actually signed into law, which made changes to, or basically just enhance the understanding and definition of disability. Sections 102 and 103 of the Civil Rights Act of 1991 clarifies defense in disparate impact cases and provides for monetary damages in cases of intentional discrimination, and it also eliminates race norming. Basically, the Civil Rights Act of 1991 and these sections in particular modified some of the basic rights provided by the federal law for employment discrimination cases, and it also gave the ability for people to receive damages in the form of, obviously, financial compensation when they had been discriminated against. I think it also made changes to the amounts that a jury could award in that case as well. And then finally, there's the Title I of Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008. And that prohibits discrimination against employees or applicants because of their genetic information, and it restricts requesting, requiring, or purchasing genetic information, as well as disclosing that information. It basically prevents a company from using genetic information to determine employment or even health insurance as well. So group health plans cannot deny coverage to a healthy person or even charge them higher premiums too, based on genetic predisposition to certain future diseases. And it also bars employers from using that information to hire or fire or promote. So it was considered one of the biggest civil rights bills of the new century, according to Senator Ted Kennedy. Finally, one of the key points that we're talking about here when we're evaluating equal employment opportunity is, as Christians, what are some of the challenges that we will face when working in human resources and dealing with these policies? And so I have a couple of key scriptures here. In Galatians 3:26 and 28, we read that you are all God's children through faith in Christ Jesus, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Mark 12:31 tells us you will love your neighbor as yourself. And Ephesians 3:19 says, so now you are no longer strangers and aliens. Rather, you are fellow citizens with God's people, and you belong to God's household. And finally, Philippians chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. Instead of each person watching out for their own good, watch out for what is better for others. Adopt the attitude that was in Christ Jesus. And the key takeaway from those scriptures in particular is kind of how I think we're all supposed to see things. We are all made in the image of God. God commands us to love one another without judgment, and therefore for us we should be accepting of diversity. We should cultivate a culture of acceptance, which is key in making everyone feel included. We have to accept and acknowledge that there are many people in this world, especially here in America. We're a melting pot. We will experience and be exposed to a lot of different preferences or different choices and lifestyles. God calls on us not to be the judge of that. That's his job. Our job is to love everyone equally as, he loved us. To know love is to know God. And so in human resources, as we're faced with the challenges of making sure that everyone is treated equally, I feel like we are being challenged just as God challenges us daily. It is our life's work to make sure that we show our faith in God to other people, and we show that by our actions and how we treat other people equally and how we love one another. And that's it. There, my references listed.